The Proximian station gleamed against the backdrop of infinite space like a massive diamond suspended in darkness. Thousands of vessels, from sleek diplomatic crafts to enormous transport ships, moved in an intricate dance around the station, their navigation lights creating a mesmerizing ballet of colors against the void. As my own transport approached the docking bay, I couldn't help but feel both excitement and cynicism about the upcoming proceedings. My name is Vex Narquilpoint, senior correspondent for the Nexus Broadcasting Network. I've covered dozens of these so-called grand trials over my career, and they've always followed the same tiresome pattern. Summon the new species, intimidate them with legal jargon, extract concessions, and move on. The Galactic Tribune had perfected this ritual over millennia as a means of maintaining control. Just another performance in an ancient theater of power. But something felt different today. Perhaps it was the unusual buzz among the other journalists gathered in the press area. Or maybe it was the way the hegemony representatives seemed unusually tense, their multi-limbed gestures more agitated than normal. I adjusted my atmospheric regulator as I made my way through the crowded atrium. Species from across the galaxy had gathered to witness the trial of humanity, the newest troublemakers in the cosmic neighborhood. The formal charges included excessive colonization, unauthorized technological advancement, and cultural pollution of protected species. Standard accusations for newcomers who dared to expand too rapidly for the hegemony's comfort. A hush fell over the crowd as the Earth vessel docked. Unlike the ornate diplomatic ships of the founding species, the human craft was functional and unassuming, almost deliberately so. When the airlock opened, I expected to see a nervous delegation led by some pompous political figurehead. Instead, a single woman emerged. Ambassador Ala Thorne walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. Her attire was simple yet elegant, lacking the ostentatious adornments typical of galactic diplomats. But it was her expression that caught my attention. She didn't appear intimidated in the slightest. In fact, she looked like someone who had come prepared to deliver a shock rather than receive one. Ambassador Thorne called out a Volterian reporter beside me. How does Earth plan to respond to these serious allegations? Thorne paused, her gaze sweeping across the assembled press. When she spoke, her voice was clear and measured. Earth is looking forward to an illuminating discussion about the nature of progress, fairness, and the future of our shared galactic community. Her diplomatic non-answer wasn't unusual, but the subtle smile that accompanied it sent whispers through the crowd. It wasn't the smile of someone preparing to grovel. As she moved through the atrium, flanked by security drones, I noted the reactions of the other species. The Manulians, with their crystalline exoskeletons, clicked their appendages in what I recognized as nervous anticipation. A group of Volterans huddled together, their tentacles intertwined in a gesture that indicated curiosity mixed with doubt. The prevailing sentiment seemed clear. This would be another routine hearing where the newcomers would offer weak defenses before accepting their punishment. But the older species, the founding members of the hegemony, seemed unusually interested in these proceedings. I spotted several high-ranking Zith diplomats observing from their hover platforms, their normally impassive faces showing subtle signs of concern. They rarely attended trials of such minor importance, yet here they were, watching intently. I managed to position myself near a Procyon information officer, one of my regular sources. Quite the turnout for a standard disciplinary hearing, I remarked casually. The Proxyans' three eyes blinked in sequence, their version of a noncommittal shrug. The humans have been unpredictable. Their expansion rate has raised concerns at the highest levels, enough to warrant the presence of the Zith Council members. The Procyon didn't answer directly, but the nervous flicker of its central eye told me everything. The summons includes extensive violations. 17 planets colonized in just 70 Earth years since they developed FDL capability. Development of weapons technology without proper oversight. Cultural interference with at least 3 protected species. The list goes on. I raised an eyebrow. Those are serious charges. Indeed, the Procyon replied. and unusual for species so young. Most newcomers take centuries to expand to even 5 systems. The formal announcement echoed through the station's communication system, calling all attendees to the Grand Chamber for the preliminary reading of charges. As the crowds began to move, I noticed a small group of representatives from younger species, those who had joined the hegemony within the last few millennia, watching Ambassador Thorne with an intensity that bordered on hope. Their body language suggested they were silently rooting for her, though they likely didn't expect much from humanity's defense. Little did they know that this trial would become a turning point in galactic history. The Grand Chamber of the Proximian Station was designed to intimidate. Its cavernous interior stretched upward into a magnificent dome that displayed a real-time view of the surrounding space. The judgment chimes, enormous crystalline structures that produced harmonics believed to stimulate truth-telling in most species, hung suspended above the central platform. Blue light bathed the chamber, casting everyone in an ethereal glow that made even the most dignified representatives appear slightly ghostly. Arbiter Zoltan Grav, an ancient Zith whose age was measured in centuries, hovered above the central podium. His elongated skull and multiple sensory appendages gave him an air of omniscience that the hegemony had carefully cultivated in their choice of arbiters. When he spoke, his voice resonated through the chamber with artificial enhancement. "This tribunal is now in session," he announced, his appendages moving in precise gestures that activated the holographic displays around the chamber. "We gather to address serious allegations against the species known as humanity, represented by Ambassador Allah, Thorn of Earth." The charges materialized in glowing text that circled the chamber in the unified galactic script. Violation of colonization quotas. Unauthorized weapons development. Cultural contamination of protected species. Violation of resource extraction protocols. Unauthorized FDL modifications. I noticed Ambassador Thorne studying the charges with what appeared to be mild interest rather than concern. She sat alone at the defense podium, having declined the traditional counsel typically assigned to new species unfamiliar with hegemony law. Prosecutor Drav Nexel, a Volturian known for his ruthless efficiency, slithered to the center of the chamber. His multiple limbs manipulated the holographic interface with practiced ease. "Esteemed arbiter, honored representatives," he began, his voice modulated to project authority. "The case before us today represents one of the most flagrant violations of hegemony protocols we have witnessed in many cycles." With a flourish, he activated a stunning visual display. Holographic images of Earth's military vessels appeared, rotating slowly to showcase their weaponry. Charts showed humanity's expansion rate, with markers indicating each colonized world. Population statistics, resource extraction data, and migration patterns filled the air in a dazzling array of information designed to overwhelm. In just 70 Earth years since developing faster-than-light capability, humans have colonized 17 planets. Nexel's voice rose dramatically. The expansion treaty clearly limits new species to no more than one colony world per decade until they have demonstrated sufficient stability and cultural integration. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. A Manulian representative clicked loudly. "Unconscionable expansion." Furthermore, Nexel continued, "These Earth vessels," he gestured to the rotating holograms, "represent military technology far exceeding the allowable development curve for a species at their stage of integration." More images appeared, humans interacting with species classified as developmentally protected under hegemony law. And here we see evidence of what can only be described as cultural contamination. Humans introducing concepts and technologies to species that must be allowed to develop along their natural path. The chamber filled with disapproving sounds as representatives from various species digested the evidence. I watched Thorne carefully, expecting to see some sign of discomfort or preparation to offer mitigating circumstances. Instead, she remained composed, occasionally making notes on her datapad. When Nexel finally concluded his damning presentation, Arbiter Grav turned to the human ambassador. Ambassador Thorne, you have heard the charges and seen the evidence presented. How does humanity respond? This was typically the moment when representatives of new species would offer humble apologies, plead ignorance of the finer points of galactic law, and promise immediate compliance. The chamber grew quiet, all eyes on the solitary human figure. Thorne stood unhurriedly and approached the central platform. She carried no visual aids, no elaborate presentations. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried clearly throughout the chamber. Esteemed Arbiter Grav, distinguished representatives of the hegemony, she began. I find myself curious about something fundamental to these proceedings. She paused, looking around the chamber. Why do these restrictions exist? Who verified that one colony per decade is the appropriate expansion rate for all species regardless of their unique characteristics? Why must technological development follow a predetermined path that happens to favor established powers? A shocked silence filled the chamber. This was not the expected response. Questioning the foundation of hegemony law was virtually unheard of. Nexel recovered quickly. Ambassador, the protocols exist to maintain order and stability in the galaxy. They are not open to debate in these proceedings. The question before this tribunal is whether humanity has violated them, which the evidence clearly shows you have. Thorne's slight smile returned. With respect, Prosecutor Nexel, I believe the validity of these protocols is precisely what should be debated, especially when they appear to have been selectively enforced throughout history. She turned to address the chamber at large. Distinguished representatives, I submit that these agreements are fundamentally inequitable because they were created by the same powers that benefit from their enforcement. Humanity has simply utilized the same loopholes that the founding species once used to establish their own dominance. Gasps and murmurs erupted throughout the chamber. I found myself leaning forward, suddenly much more interested in this trial than I had been in years. Thorne continued, her voice growing stronger. For example, historical records show that the Manulians established 7 colonies within their first 50 years of FTL capability. The Voltrans expanded to 12 worlds in just over 60 years. Yet neither faced sanctions comparable to those proposed against humanity today. She gestured to the holographic displays that still showed humanity's expansion data. If you applied today's standards retroactively to the founding species, every one of them would be guilty of the same violations for which humanity now stands accused. Nexel's facial tentacles writhed in agitation. This is absurd. The circumstances were entirely different. Were they? Thorne interrupted, a breach of protocol that caused another wave of gasps. Or is it simply that the rules changed once the founding members had secured their positions of power? Arbiter Grav struck his staff against the floor, the sound reverberating throughout the chamber. Ambassador Thorne, you will maintain proper decorum in these proceedings. My apologies, Arbiter, Thorne replied, though her tone suggested little remorse. I merely wish to establish that humanity is not denying the facts presented. We have indeed expanded at the rate indicated and developed technologies as shown. What we question is whether these actions constitute violations of equitably applied law, or whether we are being held to standards that others were not. Nexel's multiple appendages moved in agitation. The ambassador is attempting to distract from the charges by engaging in historical revisionism. These protocols have been refined over millennia to ensure galactic stability. Humanity cannot simply dismiss them because they find them inconvenient. Not inconvenient, Thorne countered. Inequitable. There's a difference. And this isn't revisionism. It's historical fact. The tension in the chamber had reached unprecedented levels. Species throughout the gallery were engaged in heated whispers. I noticed the representatives of younger species watching with newfound interest, while the older, established powers seemed increasingly uncomfortable. Arbiter Grav raised his appendages, calling for order. This tribunal will take a brief recess to allow for consideration of the procedural matters raised by Ambassador Thorne. We will reconvene in 3 standard hours. As the chamber began to empty, I pushed through the crowd to get closer to Thorne. She was surrounded by her small human security team, but I noticed several representatives from younger species attempting to make eye contact with her. Their body language suggested a mixture of surprise and budding admiration. In my decades covering these proceedings, I had never seen a new species challenge the fundamental premise of a hegemony trial. Typically, they accepted their subordinate position, paid whatever price was demanded, and eventually integrated into the lower tiers of galactic society. But humanity, through Ambassador Thorne, was signaling something unprecedented. They weren't going to play by the established rules. I couldn't help but wonder if they truly understood what they were doing. The hegemony had crushed rebellions from far more advanced civilizations than Earth. Yet something in Thorne's demeanor suggested she wasn't acting out of ignorance or bravado. She had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. As I filed my initial report to the Nexus Broadcasting Network, I included a prediction that I rarely made. This trial may mark a pivotal moment in hegemony history. For the first time in living memory, the established order is being challenged not through violence, but through the hegemony's own legal mechanisms. What I didn't yet realize was just how prepared humanity truly was. The recess provided an opportunity one couldn't miss. Using my press credentials, I navigated through the restricted sections of Proximian Station until I reached the diplomatic quarters assigned to visiting delegations. The human section was surprisingly minimalist compared to the lavish accommodations typically requested by other species. From my concealed position, I observed Ambassador Thorne meeting with representatives from several younger species in the hegemony, those who had joined within the last 1 or 2 millennia. Though I couldn't hear their conversation, their body language told a compelling story. The Tellusian delegate, whose crystalline form shimmered with emotion, leaned in eagerly as Thorne spoke. The Jaxian representative, normally reserved in hegemony gatherings, gesticulated with unusual animation. When they departed, they did so separately, maintaining the appearance of casual diplomatic courtesy rather than coordinated action. But I'd been covering interspecies politics long enough to recognize the formation of an alliance. I managed to follow Thorne back to her private quarters, where she met with her human team. Through a service duct that my Nexarian physiology allowed me to navigate, I positioned myself where I could observe their discussions without detection. The room contained a small group of humans, engineers, economists, and what appeared to be military strategists. They had transformed their diplomatic suite into a command center, with holographic displays showing complex trade routes and resource flows throughout hegemony space. "How did the preliminary meeting go?" asked an older human with military insignia. Thorne nodded, satisfied. "Better than expected. The Tellusians, Jaxians, and Vorn have all expressed support. They've been chafing under similar restrictions for centuries." "And they're willing to back us publicly?" the military officer asked. "Not yet," Thorne replied. "But they've agreed to abstain from voting against us if it comes to sanctions." "That's a start." She moved to the central display, which showed an intricate web of trade relationships. "More importantly, they've confirmed our economic analysis. In the 70 years since we've joined the galactic community, we've built deep economic interdependencies." A younger human, dressed in what I recognized as economist attire, manipulated the display. "Our rapid transport services now carry 18% of all perishable goods in the mid-arm sectors. Our medical technology has become essential to at least 7 species. Our agricultural innovations have created dependencies in 15 systems." Thorne nodded. "If the hegemony attempts to sanction us too severely, they'll disrupt their own economy. That's our primary leverage." The military officer frowned. "But they're still likely to impose some punitive measures. Are we prepared for that?" Another human, whom I hadn't noticed until now, stepped forward. "Our defense technologies are more advanced than we've publicly acknowledged. We've maintained a careful balance, revealing enough to deter pirates and raiders, but concealing our true capabilities." She pulled up technical schematics that even I, with my limited understanding of human military technology, could tell were significantly more advanced than what Nexel had presented in the tribunal. Additionally, the military specialist continued, We've discovered a loophole in Treaty Clause 87.3. It permits accelerated defensive development for species with documented history of internal conflict. Earth's history provides ample evidence for this exception. Thorne smiled. So we have legal standing for our military advancement as well. Precisely, the specialist confirmed. We're not violating the treaty. We're exercising our rights under it. The economic advisor adjusted the display again. The key is to demonstrate that punishing humanity would harm the hegemony more than it would benefit them. We need to create a public spectacle that reveals the inequities in the system while simultaneously showing the benefits of our integration. Thorne nodded thoughtfully. Tomorrow, we'll shift from defense to offense. The hegemony expects us to apologize and accept their terms. Instead, we'll put them on trial. The boldness of her statement startled me. In all my years covering the Galactic Tribunal, I had never heard such a strategy proposed. Most species, when faced with hegemony sanctions, scrambled to minimize the damage or negotiate the lightest possible penalties. Humanity was preparing to challenge the entire system. As I slipped away to file my report, I found myself reconsidering my typical cynical perspective. Perhaps this time will be different. Perhaps humanity would not just be another species humbled by the hegemony's power. For the first time in decades, I felt something akin to hope for a more equitable galactic order. While I had always maintained journalistic neutrality, I couldn't help but find myself silently rooting for Ambassador Thorne and her audacious strategy. When the tribunal reconvened, the Grand Chamber was even more crowded than before. News of Ambassador Thorne's unprecedented challenge to hegemony authority had spread throughout Proximian Station. Representatives who had initially dismissed the proceedings as routine now crowded the galleries, eager to witness what would happen next. Arbiter Grav called the session to order, his appendages moving with visible stiffness, a sign of tension in a species. This tribunal will now continue. Prosecutor Nexel, you may proceed with your arguments. Nexel slithered forward, his tentacles arranged in what those familiar with Volterian body language would recognize as aggressive posturing. Esteemed arbiter, having considered the diversionary tactics of the human representative, I wish to emphasize that the facts remain undisputed. Humanity has violated colonization quotas, developed unauthorized weaponry, and interfered with protected species. He manipulated the holographic display to show a timeline of human expansion. Whether or not other species faced similar charges in the distant past is irrelevant to the present proceedings. The law as it stands today has been violated, and appropriate sanctions must be imposed. Ambassador Thorne rose when invited to respond. This time, she carried a small device that she placed on the central platform. With the arbiter's permission, I would like to present some additional relevant data. Grav nodded reluctantly. Proceed, but confine your presentation to matters directly related to the charges. Of course, Thorne replied with that same subtle smile that had caught my attention earlier. She activated the device, and a new holographic display illuminated the chamber. This is a historical analysis of expansion rates for the founding species of the hegemony during their first century of FTL capability, she explained as a series of charts materialized. As you can see, the Manulians established 14 colonies in their first 70 years. The Volterans, 23. The Zith, an astonishing 31. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. Thorne continued before anyone could interrupt. If we apply the current standard of 1 colony per decade retroactively, every founding member of the hegemony would be guilty of violations far exceeding those attributed to humanity. Nexel's tentacles writhed furiously. This is outrageous. Those expansions occurred before the current treaty framework was established. Precisely my point, Thorne replied calmly. The restrictions were implemented only after the founding species had secured their territorial advantages. In essence, they established rules that preserved their dominance while preventing newcomers from following the same path to prosperity. She adjusted the display to show another set of data. Furthermore, I present economic analysis of treaty enforcement over the last 5,000 years. You'll note that sanctions for treaty violations have disproportionately affected younger species, while similar infractions by established powers have been routinely overlooked or minimized. The evidence was undeniable. Throughout the chamber, representatives of younger species were reacting with growing indignation as they recognized patterns that had affected their own civilizations. The older species, particularly the Zith and Voltrans, shifted uncomfortably in their positions. But that is not all. Thorne continued, changing the display again. This time, it showed complex economic flows between various sectors of the galaxy. This chart represents resource extraction rights and royalty payments structured under hegemony trade agreements. I noticed several representatives of the founding species attempting to signal Arbiter Grav, clearly wanting him to shut down this presentation. But Thorne pressed on. Analysis of these agreements reveals that over 78% of all resource royalties flow directly to the founding species, despite the fact that much of the actual extraction and processing is performed by younger members of the hegemony. She highlighted specific sections of the economic web. When humanity began negotiating our trade agreements, we discovered that the standard terms included hidden surcharges, mandatory administrative fees, and resource quotas that all funneled wealth upward to the established powers. From a concealed pocket, she produced what appeared to be a data crystal. I submit as evidence this internal hegemony directive, obtained through legitimate diplomatic channels, outlining strategies for economic management of emergent civilizations. The directive was displayed for all to see, a detailed playbook for ensuring that newer species remained economically subordinate while creating the illusion of fair integration. The chamber exploded into chaos. Representatives of younger species were on their feet, some shouting demands for explanations. The older species responded with a mixture of indignation and alarm. Arbiter Grav's calls for order went largely unheeded for several minutes. When a semblance of calm finally returned, Nexel launched a desperate counterattack. This tribunal will not be derailed by these inflammatory accusations. The charges against humanity stand, and I call for immediate sanctions. His appendages moved in rapid sequence as he outlined the proposed penalties. Complete cessation of all further colonization efforts for no less than 200 years. Dismantling of all military vessels exceeding Level 3 capability. Financial reparations for documented interference with protected species. And most importantly, his voice rose dramatically. Restricted access to FTL corridors and temporary suspension of interstellar trading rights. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a nuclear option, sanctions that would effectively cripple humanity's position in the galactic community. In the past, such threats had been enough to bring even the most recalcitrant species to heel. But Ambassador Thorne appeared entirely unfazed. Before the tribunal considers such drastic measures, I believe it would be prudent to examine the consequences. She activated another display, this one showing a detailed web of supply chains and service relationships. Humanity currently provides rapid transport services for 18% of all perishable goods in the mid-arm sectors. Our medical technologies serve as the foundation for healthcare systems on at least 27 worlds. Our agricultural innovations have increased food security for 15 systems. The display shifted, highlighting critical dependencies. If you restrict our trading rights and access to FTL corridors, these services will cease immediately. According to our analysis, approximately 342 worlds would experience significant economic disruption within the first standard month alone. She paused, letting the implications sink in, including, I might add, the homeworlds of several founding species represented here today. The chamber grew deathly quiet. Thorne had effectively revealed that any attempt to punish humanity would create widespread collateral damage throughout the hegemony itself. Furthermore, she continued, her voice steady and confident, such sanctions would likely trigger similar service disruptions from other species who have expressed solidarity with our position. It was a carefully worded threat, but one that landed with precision. I noticed several representatives of younger species nodding subtly in agreement. Humanity had been building alliances in preparation for this moment. The choice before the hegemony is clear, Thorne declared, her voice carrying throughout the chamber. You can attempt to maintain an inequitable system through punitive measures, risking economic chaos and potential dissolution of the alliances you value. Or you can recognize that the time has come for reform. She stood tall, addressing the entire assembly. Humanity did not come to destabilize the galactic community. We came to join it as equal partners. If the current structure cannot accommodate that basic principle of fairness, then perhaps it is the structure, not humanity, that needs to change. The boldness of her statement left the chamber in stunned silence. No species had ever dared to issue such a direct challenge to hegemony authority, especially not one as young as humanity. Arbiter Grav appeared genuinely shaken. This tribunal will recess immediately for emergency consultations. All voting representatives will convene in the council chamber. As the assembly broke into chaotic discussions, I noticed that the chamber had essentially divided into two factions. The established powers huddled together, their expressions and postures betraying alarm and indignation. Meanwhile, representatives of younger species were watching Thorne with newfound respect and, in some cases, barely concealed excitement. Something fundamental had shifted. What had begun as a routine disciplinary hearing had transformed into a potential restructuring of power that had remained unchallenged for millennia. Outside the chamber, heated debates erupted among the various delegations. A group of Zith representatives surrounded Ambassador Thorne, their normally imposing presence somewhat diminished by her calm demeanor. "This is unprecedented," the lead Zith declared, voice modulator pitched high in agitation. "You challenge thousands of years of established order." "Not the order itself," Thorne replied calmly, "just the inequities within it. The hegemony can continue to thrive, but as a true partnership rather than a hierarchy. You cannot possibly succeed." Another Zith warned, "The founding species will never surrender their privileges." Thorne's expression remained serene. "Then they will have to weigh those privileges against the stability of the entire system. We've calculated that a full economic disengagement by humanity, combined with similar actions by sympathetic species, would cause a 32% contraction in hegemony GDP within one standard year." The Zith representatives withdrew, clearly shaken by her assessment. I noticed that throughout the public areas of Proximian Station, view screens were showing the tribunal proceedings and the subsequent reactions. The story had captured the imagination of the entire galactic community. As a journalist, I prided myself on maintaining neutrality. But watching Ambassador Thorne calmly dismantle a system of power that had stood unchallenged for millennia, I couldn't help but feel that I was witnessing history in the making. This was no longer about whether humanity would face sanctions. It was about whether the hegemony itself would survive in its current form. For 3 tense days, the Hegemony Council remained in closed session. Rumors swirled throughout Proximian Station. Some claimed that the founding species were preparing to make an example of humanity through military action. Others suggested that significant concessions were being negotiated behind closed doors. Throughout this period, Ambassador Thorne maintained a visible presence in the public areas of the station, calmly meeting with representatives of various species and continuing to build her coalition. The humans showed no signs of anxiety, which only added to the growing sense that they held more cards than anyone had initially realized. When the tribunal finally reconvened, the Grand Chamber was filled beyond capacity. Additional view screens had been set up in adjoining areas to accommodate the overflow crowd. The eyes of the galaxy were on these proceedings. Arbiter Grav entered the chamber with noticeably less ceremony than before. His appendages moved with a stiffness that, to those familiar with Sith body language, suggested extreme discomfort. When he spoke, his voice lacked its usual authoritative resonance. After extensive deliberation, the Hegemony Council has reached a decision regarding the charges against humanity. The chamber fell silent, every being present acutely aware of the historic significance of this moment. The alleged violations will be re-examined within a broader interpretive framework, Grav announced, his careful phrasing clearly indicating a compromise. Furthermore, the Council has authorized the formation of a special committee to review the current treaty system, with particular attention to expansion quotas, technological development permissions, and resource rights allocation. He paused, and I noticed his appendages twitching slightly, a sign of extreme stress in his species. This committee will include representation from all tiers of the hegemony, including humanity. The implications were enormous. For the first time in recorded history, the hegemony was agreeing to re-examine the very foundation of its power structure, and to include a species that had been in the galactic community for less than a century in that process. Throughout the chamber, reactions varied widely. Many representatives of younger species applauded or made their species equivalent gestures of approval. Some of the older species sat in stunned silence, clearly struggling to process this unprecedented turn of events. Prosecutor Nexel had visibly deflated, his tentacles hanging limply as he absorbed the legal defeat. When Ambassador Thorne rose to speak, the chamber fell silent once more. The people of Earth thank the Hegemony Council for this wise decision. She began, her tone respectful but not subservient. Humanity did not come to this community to disrupt or destroy. We came to contribute, to learn, and to grow alongside our galactic neighbors. She looked around the chamber, making eye contact with representatives of various species. The challenges we face as a galactic community are too great for us to be divided by artificial hierarchies. Climate collapse, resource depletion, the mysteries of the universe itself. These challenges require our unified efforts and the contributions of all species, regardless of how long they have been traveling among the stars. Her voice grew stronger, filling the chamber without technological enhancement. If we are to have a hegemony, let it be one where every member has a voice, where innovation is encouraged rather than restricted, where cooperation replaces control. She extended her hand in the universal gesture of partnership. Humanity stands ready to work with all species toward this new vision of our shared future, not as subordinates, not as rulers, but as equals in the grand adventure of galactic civilization. The speech received a standing ovation from many of the younger species, while the founding members responded with respectful, if somewhat reserved, acknowledgement. The formal proceedings concluded shortly afterward, with Arbiter Grav announcing the formation of the special committee and the timetable for its work. As the chamber emptied, I observed various representatives approaching Ambassador Thorne. The Tellusians, Jaxians, and Vorn, species that had joined the hegemony relatively recently, were particularly eager to speak with her. From their animated gestures and expressions, it was clear they were discussing the possibility of forming a new economic and cultural alliance within the broader hegemony structure. More surprising were the approaches from several representatives of founding species who discreetly arranged private meetings with Thorne. Later intelligence suggested they were quietly offering compromises. We'll support reform of the expansion quotas if you maintain your supply chains to our core systems. The tribunal that had been intended to humble humanity had instead become the catalyst for the most significant reform movement in hegemony history. For the first time, the established powers were being forced to adapt to a newcomer rather than forcing the newcomer to conform to their will. In the days that followed, I had the opportunity to interview Ambassador Thorne directly, a journalistic coup that significantly elevated my standing at the Nexus Broadcasting Network. We met in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the spectacular rings of Proxima's fifth planet. Some are calling this the beginning of a new era in galactic politics. I noted my recording appendage extended. Did humanity anticipate this outcome when you arrived at Proximian Station? Thorne smiled. We came prepared for multiple scenarios. Our primary goal was to establish humanity as an equal partner in the galactic community, not as a subordinate member. The exact path to that goal was flexible. Yet you brought substantial economic leverage and legal precedents. I pointed out. This suggests extensive planning. Of course, she acknowledged without hesitation. Earth spent decades studying hegemony history, law, and economics before this confrontation. We recognized that the system was designed to keep newcomers in subordinate positions, and we developed strategies to challenge that structure. Some might call that subversive, I suggested. Her expression remained serene. Others might call it due diligence. We simply refuse to accept second-class status in a community where we have so much to contribute. I shifted topics slightly. The coalition you've built with other younger species, is this the beginning of a power block within the hegemony? It's the beginning of a more balanced community, she corrected. For too long, the hegemony has functioned as an oligarchy masquerading as a cooperative. Our alliance aims to ensure that all voices are heard and all contributions valued. And if the founding species resist the proposed reforms, Thorne's expression grew more serious. Then they will have a choice to make. They can recognize that evolution is necessary for any system to survive, or they can cling to privileges that are increasingly difficult to justify. But the galactic community has already changed. Awareness has spread. The old narratives have been challenged. She looked out at the magnificent planetary rings, their icy particles glittering in the light of the distant star. History shows that once people recognize injustice, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain it. The founding species are intelligent enough to understand this reality. As our interview concluded, I couldn't help but ask one final question. What's next for humanity in this new galactic landscape? Thorne considered the question for a moment, her gaze still fixed on the spectacular view. We'll continue building bridges rather than walls. Earth has much to offer. Our adaptability, our creativity, our unique perspective as newcomers who see the galaxy with fresh eyes. But we also have much to learn from civilizations that have explored the stars for millennia. She turned to face me directly. What's next isn't just about humanity's place in the galaxy. It's about creating a more equitable system that harnesses the unique strengths of all species. The challenges facing our shared universe are too vast for any single civilization to address alone. In the weeks following the tribunal, the ripple effects of Ambassador Thorne's challenge spread throughout the hegemony. The newly formed Reform Committee began its work, tackling the entrenched inequities in the treaty system. Though progress was slow and resistance from certain founding species remained strong, the momentum for change had become undeniable. More significant were the informal alliances forming outside official hegemony structures. Trade agreements between humanity and younger species bypassed traditional hierarchies, creating direct partnerships that benefited both parties. Cultural exchanges flourished, unhindered by the restrictive protocols that had previously limited such interactions. The founding species, faced with this shifting landscape, split into two factions. Some embraced the changes, recognizing that adaptation was preferable to obsolescence. Others doubled down on tradition, using their remaining influence to obstruct reforms while quietly strengthening their military positions. For the moment, an uneasy peace prevailed. But everyone in the galactic community recognized that a fundamental shift had occurred. The hierarchical order that had dominated for millennia was giving way to something new, a more balanced system where power was distributed more equitably among all species. 6 standard months after the tribunal, I found myself back on Proximian Station, covering the inaugural meeting of the Alliance of Emerging Civilizations, an organization founded by humanity and a dozen other relatively young species. Ambassador Thorne stood at the center of this new coalition, not as its leader, but as a catalyst for collaboration. As I prepared my broadcast to the Nexus Broadcasting Network audience spread across thousands of worlds, I reflected on how dramatically the galaxy had changed in such a short time. A single tribunal that was meant to put humanity in its place had instead set in motion a peaceful revolution that continued to reshape our shared society. This is Vex Narquil Point, reporting from Proximian Station. I concluded my broadcast. What began as a routine disciplinary hearing has evolved into the most significant restructuring of galactic power in living memory. The tribunal tried to punish humanity, but Earth's ambassador reversed the tables. And this, my viewers, is only the beginning of a new era, one in which no species, no matter how ancient or powerful, can take humanity for granted again. The transmission ended, but the story continued to unfold across the stars, writing a new chapter in the long and complex history of our galactic civilization. For once in my cynical career, I found myself genuinely optimistic about what that future might hold.